let's start in January. We'll pretend that we're coming up in Maryland. Our deer season ends on January 31st for archery. And so we've wrapped up the deer season. You've harvested a few deer. What do you start to think about once that's done? What do your mind start to shift into at the beginning of the year?
Well, actually, as I'm hunting in the fall, I'm taking notes at every stand location, blind location, of what I could do to improve the property, improve the habitat, and such. So, you know, years ago, before the invention of the cell phone, I would carry a little notebook in my hunting pack with an ink pen, and I'd take handwritten notes as I was sitting in a stand hunting of what I could do to improve things. Today, I take those notes on my phone. So once season's over, I'm referring back to those, and I've got them listed by location. So I'll list the stand location by name, something that I know what I'm talking about and can refer back to. And then under that, I'll have a list of what I want to do to make the habitat in that stand location more productive. And so once season's over, I'm going through my list and I'm visiting these various locations on the property, and I'm enacting those suggestions that I'd written down earlier in the fall, or during the winter hunting season.
But that reminds me of something that we had a forest management website, forest management training a couple of years ago called the Delmarva Woodland Stewards, and one of our guys was sitting in a deer stand, and he'd learned so much about forest management that he was sitting in a deer stand and thinking, I want to take that tree out. I want to take that tree out. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking? What are the top few things that you're looking at that come up on your notes in the hunting season?
Well, I'm looking to create the best habitat possible, first of all. So, there may be plant species that are growing, be woody vegetation or whatever, that needs to be eliminated in favor of more favorable species. So that's one thing I'll work at. The other thing is maybe I need to introduce species. For example, maybe I've got a prime stand location, but I need just a little more drawing power to it. Maybe the terrain funnels that deer movement past that stand, but I need some encouragement as well. So maybe I'll go in and plant a couple of apple trees or something in that location if the vegetation and the situation allows. Doing a lot of that. Also, access to these stands is really important. So if I don't have the greatest access, I'm trying to create maybe better access to those locations, and just anything I can do to make that a more productive stand site. And at the same time, I'm big into habitat. It's people look at me as a deer hunter, but I'm more of a conservationist, I believe. I think that it's my duty as a steward of the resources that I need to leave it better than I found it. I've got 3 young grandsons I hope to leave this property to one day. And I want to make sure that when they take it over, that it's in better shape than when I took it over. And because a lot of the farm that I have today was actually once my grandfather's. And he grew up in a totally different era where there was just woodlands everywhere. And his generation was clearing woodlands for agricultural purposes. And I'm actually going back in areas that he cleared woodlands, and I'm planting trees and creating woodlands. And I'm not sure what he would think about that. I think he would be pleased, really, because the success that I've had. And but I'm always mindful of I'm a steward of the resource for a short period of time, and one day I'm going to pass that on to another generation, and I want to make sure that I've left it in the best shape possible for the next generation. It's way more than just killing deer, and it's way more than just creating habitat for deer. Deer are very adaptive. They'll live in city limits. They'll live in the most remote places on earth. They'll live on the East Coast where you're at. They'll live out in the plain states where there's hardly a tree. They're very adaptive. And I heard it said many years ago that you can create good habitat for any other species of wildlife, be it waterfowl, quail, whatever. And the whitetail deer is going to benefit because they can just adapt.
Hmm.
That's not true with every species. You can create good deer habitat, and it does absolutely nothing for, say, the quail or wild turkeys or whatever. So, a lot of times I tell my clients, if you've got, you know, multiple interests for your property, the deer are very adaptive. Let's just create good habitat, and we can design that habitat in such a way that we can take advantage of it as a deer hunter by creating pinch points and funnels where that deer traffic is going to be narrowed down. But we don't need to get all wrapped up in just creating good deer habitat, because the deer are going to benefit from just about anything we can do.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Are there some key, uh, do you think about it in terms of like major land covers that are important, major components, and how would you think about, um, is there something missing sometimes from properties, um, that you think this is the habitat thing? You mentioned you could create habitat for quail, deer will adapt, but what, do you sometimes get to places and say, wow, this is really missing something, even though they're adapted and they can use this area, just a few little pieces of this type of habitat would really turn things around.
Most of the time, it's security cover. I see that very common, and I've consulted on probably 500 plus properties, really across the entire country. I've been out on the East Coast. I've consulted in New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey. I was just in Maryland this past winter looking at a property. So, and I've gone as far west as the Dakotas, Kansas, Nebraska, and every state in between. And the thing that I see is most hunters, land managers do not understand the importance of security cover. We get all wrapped up in food sources. We want to plant food plots, fruit trees, and things like that. But if you think about it, in the course of a period of time, be it a week or a hunting season or whatever, a deer or any other wildlife is going to spend a very tiny percentage of their time within a food source. They're going to be in security cover the majority of their time. And, I tell my clients all the time, if you want to consistently harvest the biggest bucks possible, you need to get those bucks bedded on your property. You can't, yeah, feeding them is a big part of it, and providing those food sources is a big part of the puzzle. But number one, we got to get those deer bedded on your property, because they can bed on your property, they can wait till it's dark and they can walk a mile to a prime food source. But when the sun's up, they want to be where they feel secure. And that security cover, and that really goes for other species of wildlife as well. They spend a small percentage of their time feeding, they spend the majority of their time in security cover. And that's the component that I see missing on a lot of properties.
Hmm. And a lot of people might think, so I guess, what does that look like? I think I've got a pretty good handle on what that would be. I'll throw this out there as a description: something so thick you wouldn't want to walk through it, or you get full of ticks if you did. Um, are there some components to security cover that you really that you would describe it with?
Well, the number one thing is freedom of human intrusion. I try to create a sanctuary on every property that I consult on. Uh, uh, and a sanctuary to me is an area that's free of human intrusion, that's left to the wildlife where they're not disturbed. And that's really huge. The other thing is, when it comes to vegetation within the sanctuary, diversity is huge. Just like with food sources, we want diverse food sources. You can't just plant corn, for example, and think that you're taking care of the wildlife for the year. Diversity is absolutely huge.
Hmm.
Um, each plant species is made up of different nutrient content, and a animal has the ability to balance his diet if given the opportunity. So plant diversity is absolutely huge there. And that diversity falls right into the sanctuary cover as well. So, I like woody vegetation, thick woody vegetation. Clear cuts, which a lot of people think look terrible, are actually fantastic wildlife habitat. Not only is it good thick cover for them to bed and hide in, but there's a lot of browse species that they can feed on as well. But then I also like warm season native grasses, switchgrass, and there's probably going to be some people cringe when I say that, but miscanthus. is not a native plant, but it's one that we use a lot. It's totally giant miscanthus. I realize there's species of miscanthus that's invasive, but giant miscanthus is absolutely not invasive. I've had it on my farm for over a decade, and the only miscanthus plants on my property are the ones that I planted. It hasn't spread a single plant, and that stuff is you plant a rhizome when it only spreads to about a 3 foot or so clump, and you can create a lot of structure within these native grass fields. So for example, if you was creating quail habitat with a seed mixture that included forbs and wildflowers and maybe some of the shorter grasses like little blue stem, side oats, grum, or whatever, having some clumps of these taller miscanthus plants scattered throughout that makes fantastic habitat. And those little quail or whatever, they need to be on ground level. They need to be able to get through that vegetation. It can't be so thick that they can't get through it. Well, that miscanthus is perfect for that.
Hmm.
So diversity of plant species within the sanctuary area is really critical. And, I think about my own property, and, I've got the wooded cover, which I maintain, for a high stem count to, have that thick cover and browse. But I've also got areas of switchgrass with miscanthus mixed in. And I've noticed that there are individual bucks that prefer one over the other. So I've had bucks on my farm that they preferred to bed in the switchgrass patches, and almost on a daily basis, you could just count on those bucks in the evening time when they was getting out of their beds to go feed. They were coming out of the switchgrass. That's where they'd bedded for the day.
Hmm.
Well, what's that mean to the wildlife land manager? If you're the only person in the neighborhood that's got the switchgrass field and these bucks come along that like switchgrass over other bedding cover, well, you're going to have those bucks. But diversity is key because not all bucks are going to prefer the switchgrass. They are individual. I think when we look at the whitetail and especially the mature bucks, they've got different personalities, almost like people do. They've got preferences. You can have two bucks living on the same property, but they will utilize the cover, the vegetation, the food sources on that property totally different from each other. So diversity is huge, right? Within the sanctuary as much as within the food sources.
What is it in miscanthus that you like in this to mix in with switchgrass? And do you try to is it the height or thickness? I was just walking by a switchgrass pasture or field yesterday, and it was 5, 6 feet tall, but it did thin out above 4 feet. So I could see how is it the height of miscanthus? What is it about it that you like to, and how do you like to arrange it in your plantings?
Well, miscanthus within a native grass planting is very similar. It creates structure. It's very similar to throwing a Christmas tree in a farm pond for fish.
Hmm.
Fish will relate to that structure. So if you've got clumps of this taller miscanthus, and that miscanthus will stand way better in the weather conditions, snow, ice, wind. That miscanthus has a stalk as strong as bamboo. It will withstand those harsh weather conditions, and it provides structure. So what I've noticed is that the deer, they will bed to their back with their back to these clumps of miscanthus.
Hmm.
So having the random clumps of miscanthus through a switchgrass planting creates that structure. But also, I've noticed on my own property that I've planted miscanthus in rows, like around the edge of a native grass field, and where those rows of miscanthus would form like an angle, the deer would bed in that corner. So they had that miscanthus basically on their backside, almost as protection.
Hmm.
And so I've gone to planting different shapes with miscanthus rows. So I'll go out in my field of switchgrass and I'll plant a giant X, and those deer will bed in those four pockets
Hmm.
in that X, or a giant T, will create two pockets or two corners. And
Hmm.
I've got one switchgrass planting on my farm where I've got a row along the west side, row of miscanthus along the west side of that switchgrass field, and then I come off of that row with several others. So it's almost like a T, with various legs off of it,
Hmm.
and each one of those legs provides two corners, and those deer really like to bed in the corners. I mean, it gives them good protection from predators on their backside, but like I said, it's probably twice as tall as the switchgrass, stands way better, and just gives them that protection. But yet, it's not so thick that the game birds, rabbits, whatever, can get through it really easily.
Cool, cool. Um, I was just thinking about a question, and it have you could you even create lots of small X's and really maximize that sort of component?
Yeah, absolutely. There's
Yeah,
no limit to what you can do.
right.
Another way I like to use it is if I've got a tree stand or one of my clients has a tree stand at the edge of that switchgrass field, the deer are obviously bedding out in that switchgrass in the center somewhere, and they're going to exit that switchgrass field in the evening. You can plant a row of miscanthus from like the heart of that field right out to the edge where that tree stands at, and those deer will follow that edge right out past the tree stands.
Oh wow, so cool. Um, Now this is something I asked Mike about, and he said that you have he mentioned, yeah, he has a debate with Bronson Strickland about this. It's about whether you might want to include diversity of food resources inside that bedding cover, the switchgrass and miscanthus areas. Put some clovers in there, some forbs, or other sort of things that they could even eat while inside there.
Yeah, so well, the general train of thought is that you mix in some forbs or whatever food sources within that switchgrass, and you're providing both food and cover at the same location. From a hunting standpoint, I do not like that because when a deer is bedded out in that switchgrass, when he gets hungry, to make him susceptible to hunting pressure, we need to get him on his feet moving. If he just stands up out there in the middle of that switchgrass and drops his head and starts eating, he's going to be very tough to kill.
Mm-hmm.
But if he stands up and he has to walk out to the edge to the food source, that makes him vulnerable and a whole lot, more killable for the client. Um, just a differing of opinion. Now, I do believe that there's a place for both management approaches. If you was just trying to provide a wildlife sanctuary and hunting was not a consideration, then absolutely I could see the benefits of having those food sources combined with the bedding cover.
All right. All right. So let's go back to the calendar year. So you've got your notes of things you want to change. You're sitting in your stand. You've got lots of hours to imagine about what you would do and things you'd like a little differently or how to get in and out. Um, what are some of the things that you would start implementing? It's starting to be February, so it's cold still, too early to plant. What are some of the things you might be preparing for early on? And I've got some ideas for what we would do for quail at that time, but I'd be curious to hear what you're thinking about for deer.
Well, my list is usually so substantial that I don't even get through it by spring. I work until spring green up, and I start, as soon as hunting season's over. And sometimes I don't even wait for hunting season to be over, depending on the location of the project and what the project is. But so I'm going from basically the 1st of January, even though season is still open in select areas until spring green up with these projects. And, a lot of it is TSI or timber stand improvement. Where we'll go in and cut tree species that are tree species and actually individual trees as well that are never going to have timber or wildlife value in favor of the species that are going to have wildlife value and timber value in the future. It would be no different than if you had weeds growing in your lawn and you went out and you sprayed those weeds. You want to keep the good species and promote their growth, even increase their growth rate by cutting out those poor species. I do a lot of that. I can't tell you how many chainsaws I've wore out over the years, and I've got a stack of chains for my chainsaw that's unbelievable. That I don't sharpen them myself. I take them to be sharpened, and when I walk in to have them sharpened, I've got a wad of them in my hand. So I wear out chainsaws. I wear out the whole saws on a pretty regular basis. I don't even know how many chainsaws I got at the moment, 5 or 6 anyway. But a lot of chainsaw work. Getting that sunlight. The key to good wildlife habitat is opening up the canopy and getting sunlight hitting the ground.
Mhm.
And to do that, you've got to cut trees,
Yep.
but be selective about how you do it. I don't. I think there's a lot of people out there just running wild with chainsaws, cutting trees that would have a lot more value in the future. And I mean, that's one of my pet peeves is that the deer hunting community is kind of promoted opening up the canopy to create good deer habitat. But while a lot of guys are doing that, they're destroying the timber. I mean, we can be great stewards of the resource as far as whitetail managers and still be mindful of other uses of the resource. My grandsons, for example, they may not be deer hunters, when they take over my farm 10, 20 years from now or whatever. I think it's doing them a disservice to go in and just randomly cut trees without even, taking into consideration the species. So, I'm going to leave every good oak, every good walnut, um, any kind of mass producing trees, whether it's a soft mast or whatever, I'm going to leave the best ones, knowing that the next generation may have totally different uses for this farm than what I have today.
Yeah. What are, I also think about around here, it seems like sweet gums and maples are kind of two unpreferred timber species. I don't know if they have a lot of timber value, also in terms of, long-term thinking about the resource. And I have noticed that maples resprout. When I cut a maple in the winter, it resprouts gangbusters, and the deer love that. They will take every leaf off that maple as it resprouts. Have you found that in your space too?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not in an area that has sweet gums at all. They're a little too far north for that. We do have some maples, typically hard maples. We do have some soft maples, I guess, in the river bottoms. But yeah, when those sprouts come off of those stump sprouts come out, the deer absolutely hammer them.
Hmm. What other target species do you look to take out? Like I don't know if you have black tupelo where you are. They're a common understory species, but they provide berries for wildlife. So
Mhm.
I am oftentimes wondering, what do we do with some black tupelos here? Do I leave those for the birds, or what are some of the things you might take out?
Yeah, we don't have those either. We have a lot of the ones I'm cutting the most are probably hackberry is one, locust, a little bit of elm, mulberry. We got mulberries growing like weeds. You might think that you need to leave the mulberries for the birds. I'm telling you, I could cut every mulberry on my farm, and those birds would have all the mulberries they could possibly eat because we got them just growing wild like weeds.
Right.
That's one that I cut a lot. Those are probably the main ones.
Do you get hollies coming in your understory much? Okay.
No, we don't have that at all
Yeah.
either.
We have a lot of hollies, and I could see them. Well, and most they're not. I don't think they're very much preferred as a forage species. But I let on this property I was mentioning earlier that the deer pressure is so high is that there's a browse line on the hollies even. So that's another species that I wonder about whether it's something how we should manage for that.
We've got a real issue here in the Midwest with some invasives: bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, Russian olive. Those three are they're just taking over the Midwest, and that's something that it's a battle that I'm never going to win, and it's a battle that's never going to end. But it's a battle I still wage, at least to some degree, when I'm out there doing TSI work.
Yeah. I am in the same boat with something called Japanese stilt grass. I don't know if it's invaded all your wetland areas yet, but
Uh,
it's nasty, and it's sort of blankets the entire understory of most of it's mostly shade tolerant, but all the understories in my river bottom, creek bottoms, they're just and it just blankets everything. So I'm continuing to battle that one, and yeah, it's tough. It's a tough one.
yep. Well,
Um,
those invasives, exotic invasives especially, are they're a nightmare. It's a never-ending battle.
yeah. Yeah, a lot of our, well, I know I myself, I prefer not to use chemicals, prefer not to use poison on the landscape, but I have certainly come around after 3 years of trying to control it. You can try to control Japanese stilt grass mechanically. It's an annual grass, and so you can kill it now, or right a few weeks ago, you can cut it real short, right when it's about to set seed, and hope so it doesn't seed. Well, it hasn't worked yet. I'm on year three, and it's just as bad as ever. So I'm starting to consider more seriously some of the pre-emergent herbicides, and think about some of those things.
Yep.
I'm guessing you use a lot of you bring a squirt bottle with with a herbicide mix, do you spray the stumps when you're managing the autumn olive and bush honeysuckle, or what's your approach for those?
Yeah, I do. I use a mix of Garlon 4 Ultra and diesel fuel.
Hmm.
The diesel fuel kind of acts as a surfactant, keeps that chemical there where it's going to work.
Hmm.
Most of my tree stumps, I do not spray. The one exception is locust, thorny locust. If you cut that tree and you don't spray the stump, 20 trees will shoot up from the roots of that tree that you just cut off.
Hmm.
So you're not gaining anything if you don't spray the stump. In fact, you're making the situation worse if you don't spray the stump. So that's one species that I will spray the stump as well.
Right. Have you tried the Craig Harper mix? I think that's Garlon 3, 50%, Imazapyr 10%, and 40% water.
I have not, I haven't even heard of it.
Okay, I think it's a pretty popular mix, and I think there are certain trees that are resistant to the Garlon 3, and there's certain trees that are resistant to the Imazapyr. So by mixing the two, he's able to
Hmm.
uh, to kind of have one spray bottle that'll take care of everything when he's out in the woods.
I have never found anything resistant to Garlon 4 and diesel.
Okay,
You
all
spray
right.
it. You don't even have to cut the young trees and the those invasives.
Mhm.
If you just spray the stump, or the trunk, say 6 inches off the ground, and you spray it all the way around, it'll take care of it. You don't even have to have a chainsaw. There's a lot of times I'll go onto a property without a chainsaw just to spray the trunks.
All right, wow. And that's Garlon 4 Ultra.
Yeah. Now it might. What'll typically happen is it'll leaf out the following year, but the leaf, it won't be near as full. It's only about a half leaf.
Hmm.
And then the second year it doesn't leaf out at all. So
Yeah.
it's like about a 2-year process to kill it, but it'll definitely do the trick.
All right, all right.
Hey, this is Hunter. What time of year are you applying to the trees?
Well, the best time is in the fall when that tree's going dormant because it's taking the sap or the nutrients of that plant down and store it in the root system for the winter. And if you can spray it then, it'll take that poison or that chemical down into the root system. However, the issue with that is most hunters do not want to be out on their property in the fall spraying chemicals. They'd rather be sitting in a tree stand hunting and not chasing the deer off with the human activity. I've had good luck year round, but ideally the fall would be the best time to do it.
Yeah, late summer, fall, yeah. Right now, if it's still got green leaves, we're looking at, do you have calorie pair issues where you are?
It's really spotty. I don't have it on my farm whatsoever. Um, and it's very limited. There's some situations that I've seen, especially along the interstates here in the Midwest. You get into, uh, especially around larger cities, you get to those interstate systems as you're coming into larger cities. A lot of times I'll see the calorie pair situation, but out in the country where I'm at, I haven't seen much of it.
All right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit to spring, and it's say it's May, June, and it's food plot planting time. How do you look at food plots and the overall management? And I think I've heard you say before that soybeans are your number one, but could you elaborate on some of the overall types of food plots you might think about putting in the spring?
Yeah. So again, diversity is key. I want to provide as many different plant species that the deer will feed on as possible, because if there's a nutrient deficiency and one of those plant species is high in that nutrient, the deer will know it and they will crave it and they will feed on it. And a healthy deer is a productive deer, is a deer that's growing big antlers and raising healthy fawns. So diversity is absolutely huge. I don't know if you're aware that I own a food plot seed company, Real World Wildlife Products, and that started from the development of seed blends on my farm. I was just trying to make my farm the best that it could be, and that led to the seed company. But the soybeans are huge. Um, everybody gets wrapped up on the soybeans in the summertime when they're green. The deer love them because they're high in protein, but they really shine in the winter. You get that really cold weather, you get a brutal cold front with snow and temperatures about zero. They absolutely will flock to those soybeans just like a magnet. Corn, We've got a corn, a high fat corn. We call it NutriCrave corn.
Hmm.
NutriCrave corn has about 1.5 times the protein levels of typical ag corn and 3 times the fat level of typical ag corn. It's one of the first thing the deer wipes out on my farm each year. So, this time of the year, throughout the summer, the deer are feeding in high protein food sources like the soybeans, alfalfa, things like that. But then in the fall, early fall, like right now, they're shifting to high carbohydrate food sources. So, the corn, it was one of those. Acorns is another. They're trying to put on fat for the winter. So, they're really hitting those hard.
Yeah. I've heard you mention the deadly dozen a couple of times. Is that, I said 12 plant species on your show, and
Mhm.
I'm trying to look at the list on my computer screen. I can't pull it up here, but what do you got? Let's see, you got some maybe wheat and a few other things in there.
Yeah, so Deadly Dozen is a fall planted blend. Where we're at, we want to plant it around the 1st of September. It's got a lot of brassica type plants, turnips, radish, sugar beets, rape, kale, things like that. It's also got cereal grains, winter wheat, rye, oats,
Pea,
barley,
the winter pea in there.
winter pea.
Yeah, that stuff I find deer just destroy. I love that.
Well, and that's a plot that the deer are going to be hammering from the time it comes up, in early fall, clear through until next spring, because those dozen plant species are going to, their prime window is going to be different for each of those 12. So, when it first comes up, the deer are going to be hitting those peas and those sugar beets the hardest. And then a little bit later, they're going to be hitting those cereal grains. And you get into the winter months, and they're going to be hitting those bulb plants, the turnips and radishes and such. But then that plant or that blend will actually survive the winter and green up in the spring. It makes a great turkey plot too, because it's one of the first things that greens up in the spring, and gives deer and other wildlife a good food source as they're coming out of winter, to get off to a good start in the spring.
Yeah. Now, I'll mention most of the time, and I'm sure you already know this, Don, is that most of these aren't native. These are introduced species, most of them from the old world. But, the way I think about it, in an area that is completely invaded with stilt grass, for example, that's providing about 0 feed for wildlife, putting in something like this is just a real benefit. It just changes the whole dynamic for the landscape. I'm curious how you kind of think about the intensity of planting annual food plots versus a more natural system like old field management.
Well, I actually produced a video. It's on my um, YouTube channel that I would encourage everybody to go watch. It's about the fallacy of an all native property. So if you can go right down the list of plant species in this country that are not native. Apples are not native, pears are not native, clover is not native, alfalfa is not native, corn is not native, soybeans are not native. We went through every plant species that we could think of that's grown in food plots, and the only one that's native to this country is sunflowers. Everything else has been imported. If we took all the non-native plants out of this country, it would look totally different. There would be no agriculture as we know it today. Almost everything that's being grown, sorghum, another one, everything that's being grown in our ag fields for the most part is non-native, came from other parts of the world. And I 100% agree about the non-native, exotic, invasive species. We don't want to be introducing invasive species, but I think that some of these purist extremists have gone over the edge, even thinking that we can have any kind of habitat without non-native species.
Hmm. Well, this is interesting. I found the video. I'm going to post it in the chat for everybody. I hear
I
you.
hope everybody watches this one. This
All
is
right. Yeah. Well, one thing I've been trying to do, and I'm thinking about doing some of these experimental plots on Point Pleasant Farm, is as I plant native wildflower plots and mixes, I just take note of everything that the deer are eating. So I want to create a native mix of black-eyed Susans. I've noticed just a handful of species. I got a list of them. I'll actually put that in there too. But I've noticed, like, gosh, it would be kind of neat to have one that is native wildflowers too. And I don't know if anybody's done that yet. Maybe you
Well,
have seen
somebody has
some of that
probably
out there.
tried. If you can find one, I'd be really interested in it. I'm a very open-minded person, and I don't have a mind that can't be changed with facts. Now, a lot of times I have to see it firsthand for myself on my own property, but I'm willing to test anything here. And I think one of the reasons for my success has been that I'm open-minded. I don't think I know it all. I'm learning every single day and will to the day I die. But I don't know of any native species that you're going to come up with that are going to have the protein content of like alfalfa and soybeans.
Yeah.
And especially when you get into the winter months, what can possibly compete with soybeans in January? There's a lot of plant species. I know Dr. Strickland's done some work with this and done some analysis with some of these native four weed species, whatever you want to call them. And there's some of those that have very good nutrient values. Not only the protein values, but the calcium and the micronutrients and other things. But the thing of it is, it's very short lived. Those nutrient levels are high, yeah, when that plant is in the young growth stage, but once that plant is mature, and then when it's dead, when it's standing there dead in the winter, it's got almost zero nutritional value to the animal. Where some of these non-natives, like soybeans, for example, do. And I just can't envision a situation where natives only are ever going to be able to compete with some of these non-native plants. And if you can find something, I'll test it on my farm. I'll be happy to, because I'm always looking to get better at what I do.
Cool. Yeah, I've just popped in. I've got a note document on my phone that I just keep putting in things as animals come in. And but summer sweet is a native bush we planted. We have a little native garden thing in the front, and the deer destroy it every summer. And I've seen forest understories in some parts of Maryland. It's also called sweet pepper bush, or clethra is the genus name. And boy, that one the deer seem to love, and that's a nice summer plant. But yeah, there's a whole list. I'll be in touch with you if we end up coming up with a mix. It'd be fun to give you a little thing to try out.
I'll definitely try it.
Yeah, but yeah, the improved varieties, yeah, seeing how well clover grows and a lot of these other things, they spring up so fast, and the quality it's hard to beat. One thing about soybeans, I wonder if you are familiar with it. Seems like it's soybeans in the winter is whether and the brassicas are there it seems with chicken feed, soybeans have to be steamed because there are something called anti-nutritional factors found in soybeans before they're steamed and heated. And there's several tannins in them that cause some digestive issues and make it difficult to digest. I don't know if by winter time, is it the freeze thaw cycle? Does that break down some of those anti-nutritional factors? Or because I found sometimes deer don't go after them until kind of late in the season.
Yeah. So besides my experience with wildlife, I've been a livestock farmer my whole life. Got beef cattle. I've had hogs and chickens and other things as well. I totally understand what you're saying. Um, a lot of times when soybeans are used in livestock feed, they're roasted. They don't use raw soybeans. They're either roasted or they use soybean meal.
Yeah.
But to kind of shift this just a little bit, one thing that I've noticed is that a deer and other wildlife can absolutely detect a GMO, a genetically modified plant, over a non-GMO. And they prefer the non-GMO hands down. And when you start getting into some of these plants that have been genetically modified in multiple ways, for example, enlist soybeans. So enlist soybeans, they can be sprayed with glyphosate or Roundup. They can be sprayed with Liberty or glufosinate. And they can also be sprayed with 2,4-D. And none of those chemicals will kill those soybeans. If you plant an enlist soybean right next to a non-GMO soybean that's not been genetically modified, I absolutely promise you without any doubt, I don't even have to be there to see it, I know they will totally wipe out the non-GMO before they will ever touch the GMOs.
Wow.
You could even go every other box in your planter with GMO corn and non-GMO corn, and they will go through your field and they will eliminate every non-GMO row because that's what they prefer. And they can detect that. So
wow.
we've tried to stay away from GMO, genetically modified plants in our seed mixes. The one exception is our soybeans, which are Roundup Ready or glyphosate tolerant. But that is the only trait in those soybeans that's been modified. That you can't spray them with anything else. And if it wasn't for weed control issues, we would not even do that. But our customer base just almost demands it.
Yeah, well, I have thrown out soybeans without doing any weed control, and they will get choked out in some environments, and you kind of, I can see, I learned the importance of having weed control for soybeans too. So,
Yep.
wow, that's interesting. I have not detected that, but I will start looking at that. And you're talking about the forage as well as the soybeans in the winter, or in particular times or year round?
Well, it's year round. An example right here on my place, I've got about a 3 acre field of food plot of our Roundup Ready soybeans, which has, one genetic trait that's been modified. And literally 10 feet away is 25 acres of soybeans that are enlist, which is the triple GMO traits. And the deer literally have wiped out my 3 acre plot to the point where I had to plant it 3 times this year. And they're not even hardly touching the 25 acres that's 10 feet away from this plot.
Wow. Wow.
You need to test that. I'm telling you,
Yeah. Yeah.
you'd be amazed. And you can do it with corn, you can do it with soybeans, whatever. They know it. They can detect a non-GMO versus a GMO.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, we had difficulty seeing, we tested a variety of different forage soybeans versus conventional soybeans, mostly as for agricultural crop protection to plant buffers around fields to see whether forage soybeans could kind of keep deer at the edge of the field. It's a very challenging methodology because the plants grow different sizes and everything else. We had cameras on each of the plots, and it would sort of motion activated trigger, so we'd see how many pictures of them grazing. And we just had too much variation in the deer activity to detect statistically significant differences. We had these like one plot they'd use a ton, the other one they would hardly use, and it's so hard because the deer always come out of the field on the same corner, and they would always hit the early corners first, and so they wouldn't make it to the end of the field, and so it was a challenging thing for us to measure. But yeah,
Yeah, the whole forage soybean thing with the wildlife is kind of interesting because forage soybeans have their place as livestock feed. Um, those forage soybeans are taller, they got bigger leaf, they got more tonnage per acre. They're great to mow and bale or put up as haylage for livestock feed. But when a deer is out there in the wild and he's feeding on plants, he's not feeding on those giant mature leaves. He's feeding on that new tender growth at the top of the plant that's just coming out. That's the part that he wants to eat. And the forage soybeans for wildlife, I think, is way overstated. And one example in our test years ago, we were trying to look for a way to keep the deer off of our soybean plots because we've had this situation that I just described many times. And we was taking these plots and we was planting forage soybeans around the edge. Say the first 30 feet all the way around the edge was forage soybeans, and then we would put our soybeans in the middle. They're a higher oil soybean, which means a higher fat content, which is what makes them attractive. And what the deer would do is they would walk right through those forage soybeans and not even touch them to get to the beans in the middle. So it never worked for us.
yeah.
I suppose it could, depending on what you have growing in the middle of your field, but it did not work for us at all.
Yeah, I've not detected, like I said, there's a lot of variation, and like you've already said, different deer have different preferences, so it gets even more confusing at that point because maybe one deer does prefer the forage soybeans, but the other one likes the other one. So and I also think some of these characteristics of preferences seem to be regional. Like with brassicas, I've had no success having deer graze on brassica plots. We had rape, we had turnips, we had radishes out, and then we had one with clover and winter wheat, and we had one with winter pea. They were all in the winter pea and wheat and the clover and wheat. They didn't even touch. They all bolted out, and it was like not even a single bit of forage on them. And I don't know what that's all, even despite the winter and the cold and everything else.
Yeah, when I first started planting those years ago on my farm, the first year they didn't touch them at all. The second year they nibbled on them a little bit. The third year they were eating them. It's
Hmm.
almost like they had to acquire a taste for it.
Yeah.
Well, one thing about the brassicas is the nitrate levels in those leaves are going to change as the weather gets cold. So if you do a tissue sample of those plants, say early October, and then do another one in mid-December, you're going to see a big difference in the nitrate levels. And those nitrates make those plants bitter and they're not palatable whatsoever. You need some cold weather and not just a frost or two. You need some consistent temperatures in the 20s and even lower to change those nitrate levels in those leaves to get the deer to really want to eat those
Hmm.
brassica plants.
Right. Right. Um, cool. We have, oh my, so we have 3 minutes left. I don't know if you're willing to go a little bit long and see if anybody will open up to the audience, if anybody has some questions. Um, gosh, we didn't even, there's so much more we could cover, but we did cover a lot. If anybody in the audience wants to jump in with any questions or put something in the chat, I did have a question from Anthony Antonucci about whether pollinators can detect GMO or non-GMO plants and whether they have the same sort of deterrence. I don't know if you've ever seen any of that, Don, but there are some pollinators that will use soybean flowers, and I think we'll use some of those. We'll pollinate some of those. I don't generally they're planted as a. Um, I wouldn't say that's a very strong pollinator attractor plant. But I wonder if there is something to that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Don?
I have zero experience with that actually. So
Yeah.
I'm afraid I can't be of any assistance there.
Right. Yeah, I'm not sure. There is a short time period of time in which soybeans have small flowers, and I'm sure some of the insects are using them. But I do not know of anybody having detected that change. But it's a good question. There are some people that I know that I'll reach out to them, see if they are studying pollination and aspects in soybean fields. So I'll try and find those people and get back to you, Anthony. Um, I guess Uh, maybe we can close on one final topic. We've got a couple minutes here. And this is maybe small enough that we could get to, is the idea of minerals and mineral supplements. Their importance not only for attracting, but also for nutritional development of the deer. Do you have a favorite mineral mix that you prefer? And I guess you probably sell it at through your real world wildlife products store.
Yeah, we do. So
I'm not trying to sell your stuff for you. I'm
yeah,
just saying so
this
everybody,
might take
but I
more
do
than two
respect
minutes.
Don. I've listened to Don on his podcast, and I come away after you're done talking, Don. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've got so much to learn. So, but yeah, feel free. What do you like for minerals?
So this is going to probably take more than 2 minutes, but for about 20 to 25 years, I had a captive herd of research whitetails, and my two biggest areas of interest were nutrition and genetics. And basically, I was just trying to learn as much as I could about deer to become a better deer hunter and land manager. And as part of that, there was one period where I took 7 sets of twin buck fawns, um, sired by the same buck, out of the same mother. And I took those 7 sets and I split them into 2 pens. So there were 7 bucks in one pen, 7 bucks in the other pen. Every buck had a twin brother in the opposite pen. And I fed those deer. I was trying to determine if mineral supplementation made any difference in antler growth whatsoever. Each pen got the same feed, all they could eat of the same feed. They were not limited whatsoever to that feed. The one pen, however, I would top dress their feed with a mineral mix that I'd come up with. And then each fall, we would tranquilize those bucks and we would measure their gross antler inches, bucks in each pen. And then we would total up the inches of antler in the pen without the mineral supplementation and then with the mineral supplementation. And did this for 3 years for while those bucks were 1, 2, and 3 years old, grew their first 3 sets of antlers. And I concluded that I thought that I could probably add about 15% to the gross antler score of a mature buck. And I had Dr. Bronson Strickland from Mississippi State Deer Lab on my podcast, and I posed that question to him if he believed mineral supplementation could add inches to a mature buck. And they had done a similar study, and his figure was even higher than my 15%. I think it was 18 to 20%. Now that's going to vary greatly based on the region of the country. So the richer the soil where you're at, the less impact mineral supplementation is going to have. The poorer the soil, the more difference you're going to make by that mineral supplementation. So here in the Midwest, we probably, and it's illegal in my home state of Illinois, but I also own property in Ohio where I can do it. But yeah, you can do it. So we took that mineral mix that I'd concocted in my test, and I worked with Dr. Clifford Shipley at the University of Illinois, and also Dr. Aaron Gaines, who's a livestock nutritionist, and they perfected that just a little bit, tweaked my formula to some degree. And what we found was critical, or what I learned from these guys that was critical, was that certain nutrients have to be in specific ratios to each other for the deer to properly utilize them. A couple of examples: calcium and phosphorus needs to be in a 2-to-1 ratio. There needs to be twice as much calcium as there is phosphorus. Copper and zinc needs to be in a 4-to-1 ratio. But yeah, so we actually, I think it was in 2017, 16, somewhere back in there, we came out with Maximizer Deer Mineral, unlike anything on the market. And that's the one I would recommend, obviously.
Right. Well, that is really interesting to hear about. Yeah, in California, did my graduate studies in California, and a lot of their soils are low in selenium, and so that would oftentimes lead to antler deformation, or one antler not growing and the other one growing kind of strangely. So yeah, it certainly can solve that out there.
Yep.
We got a question from D Plummer. And I think we covered this a little bit at the beginning. Maybe you could elaborate on it. Do you prescribe hinge cutting as habitat or food creation practice? Why or why not? Actually, I don't know if we did cover this exactly. Hinge cutting, what situations benefit most? Many of our parks are like many of our forests are like parks in the understory due to the browse line. Seems like the only way to create some of these sanctuary areas you were describing maybe some kind of practice like hinge cutting. And that's from David Plummer. Thanks, David.
Yeah, so I'm not a fan of hinge cutting. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't have its place in very specific situations, but when you hinge cut a tree, you basically cut it, part way through, tip it over. That top is still connected to the root system. The tree stays alive. It's just that you put it down on the ground where deer can feed on the branches, or creates ground cover. They can bed, around that fallen tree. My issue with that is if that tree is of so little value to you that you would hinge cut it, why not just cut it off all the way and allow better vegetation to start there? Because that tree is, when you hinge cut it, it's still alive. That root system is still competing with all the other trees around it, all the other vegetation around it. Why not cut it off and start over? Let sunlight come in, because that tree, when it's hinge cut and it's laying on the ground, it's still shading the ground, and no vegetation is going to grow in that shaded ground. Why not just cut it off and let the sunlight in, let new vegetation start? I think that you may not get the instant result that you get with a hinge cut, but I think long term that's a better option than the hinge cutting.
Now, what about using it to direct traffic in that case
Well,
situation?
that fallen tree can direct traffic just as well. If you cut it off, 4 feet above the ground and hinge it, or if you cut it off a foot above the ground and drop it, you can still direct deer traffic with that fallen tree.
Gotcha. Yeah, I tried that with a maple, and I was thinking, seeing how much deer ate maple resprouts, I thought they would go to town on the canopy, but they haven't touched the canopy. They ate the resprouts at the base where it started sprouting. But there seems to be something about the maturity of the leaves even on preferred browse like that. They just haven't even touched it.
Right.
One final thing, Don, I don't know if you have to go, but if you have a moment, I'm sure a lot of our audience are curious about deer management. And when you think about whether culling works, or the types of harvest you would think about to try to make your herd better, or what kind of what kind of practices can you do when you're hunting to try to facilitate a better deer herd on the whole in the long run? Do you have time to answer that question?
Well, I can give you a short answer that most deer hunters in North America do not control enough ground to make any impact whatsoever. I mean, it's even if you own 500 or 1,000 acres, you're not going to impact anything because your neighbors surrounding you are going to have a bigger impact than you are. You could think that, hey, we need to take a bunch of does. So I shoot 20 does on my farm. Well, guess what happens? 25 show up from the neighbor to replace the 20 you just shot. It's impossible for I can't even think of a single situation with any of my clients, hundreds of clients, where they controlled enough ground to have an impact on a on the deer herd as far as age structure, sex ratios, things like that.
Right. Right.
Now,
So
what you can do, let me build on that
yeah.
just a little bit. What you can do as a hunter is you can impact which bucks on your property have a chance to make it to the next age class and which don't. So
Mhm.
the bucks you shoot and the bucks you pass are going to impact the bucks you have down the road. And
Mhm.
I think in wild herds, what happens a lot of times is what's called high grading. So, two bucks walk out into a field. One of them, they're both 3.5 years old. One of them's an 8-pointer that scores 120 inches. The other one's a 10-pointer that scores 150 inches. Well, guess which one gets shot every single time? The 150-inch 10-pointer. Well, that leaves the smaller 8-pointer to grow into the older age class to breed does for who knows how many more years. And as a hunter, you can impact, and I've done it on my farm. You can impact which bucks have a chance to make it to the next age class and which ones don't. And on my farm, with my guests and such, we're making an effort to take out the smaller racked bucks in each age class earlier and allowing the better antlered bucks to live to the older age classes.
Right. Right. Now, is there anything to harvesting older mature does? I heard the other day that's some of these mature does can actually drive off bucks or drive off even their own progeny, their spike bucks, their young bucks.
Well, they all do that actually.
Mhm.
It's just Mother Nature's way of preventing inbreeding. So there was research done by Dr. Carl Miller at the University of Georgia, where they radio collared buck fawns, and they actually did it in the Midwest. Illinois is where it happened at my home state. And what they found was that maternal aggression. So a doe has fawns, and those fawns stay with her through the summer, the fall, the winter. The next spring, when she gets ready to have her next set of fawns, um, she just develops maternal aggression towards her male offspring, and she drives them away, and they go relocate. And on average, in this study, those bucks would relocate 5 to 20 miles from where they was born. 90% of them did.
Hmm.
The interesting thing was that if that mother was killed, whether she got shot by a hunter or hit by a car, whatever, those numbers reversed. Then she wasn't there to run those young offspring off. 90% of the time, they stayed right where they was born. And if you ever hear of a situation where like a mountain lion or a bear is seen well outside of its normal range, it's almost always a young male. So Mother Nature's way of preventing inbreeding is the young males leave their birth area to go set up a new home range elsewhere. It happens with all wildlife species. And when you see these bear that are where they're not supposed to be, it's a young male 99% of the time. So that maternal aggression is not just with big dominant does. Every white-tailed doe will run off her male offspring.
Hmm. So do you think it's worth for land managers, how late do you recommend waiting before you would harvest a doe, I guess with a buck? Or if you see a doe with a spike, a year and a half old buck that's still with his doe and she's got two really young fawns with her. I've got that happening in my backyard. What would you do in that situation?
Well, that spike is I can almost guarantee you he's not related to that doe.
Hmm.
He's just one of those bucks that, that first year when they've got that first rack, these bucks are just on a wandering mission.
Hmm.
You hear about bucks busting through the plate glass window at a Walmart or something. It happens typically in the summertime. What it is, it's these young bucks that are dispersing, and they're just wandering about the countryside. They'll go into town, and they're just looking for a new home range. And a lot of times they come across to another deer and they'll follow it around for a while. And I promise you that deer is not related to that doe, or that buck is not related to that doe.
Right. And so do you wait as long as you can in the season? If you were going to do this, would you wait late into the winter so that those fawns have more time with their, so with the button buck situation, then would you recommend like harvesting the doe to keep him from running off?
Absolutely. So on my farm, any doe that comes by with twin buck fawns is in trouble. So, and
How
even if they
late
have
do
a
you wait?
single
Do you
buck
wait as
fawn,
long as you can to reduce stress on the fawns, or?
no, you don't have to. But by fall, they're fine. They'll survive.
Yeah. Well, I've always wondered because there's so much of this. I think there's some research, probably out of Mississippi State Deer Lab, talking about the importance of some of those early, well, the doe's health in utero for that buck, but also I wonder, gosh, how much is happening in those at month 6 months to 9 months, that he's learning or picking up from that doe from its mom that might hinder him later.
Well, he's learning about his exact environment at that time, that the land he's actually living on. I mean, she's already encountered danger hunters at certain locations, and she's probably teaching him to avoid them. But it all comes down to the management. If you've got people on your property that are going to shoot button bucks, yeah, it's probably going to have an impact.
Right. Right. Well, Don, this has been super helpful. Thank you for staying on a little bit longer. Thanks everybody for joining. Has any final comments you want to share, or to wrap this up?
No, I just appreciate the opportunity. Be glad to come back anytime.
Oh, appreciate it, man. I love it. And I always learn a lot. I'll keep following you stuff online. And thanks everybody for joining. Here come the thank yous on the chat. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Anthony, Terry. All right, everybody, have a great day. This will be up on YouTube. If you missed any part, we'll put it up in the next few days here. Thank you, Don. Have a good one.
Yeah. Thank you. God bless everyone.
Take care.